Imagine you are a Spanish explorer. Like the year is 1582.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
You have just sailed across the entire world, right?
Yeah.
And you are armed to the absolute teeth with these strict, rigid, deeply patriarchal laws of 16th century Europe.
Right, the classic colonizer mindset.
Yeah.
You're fully expecting to conquer, to convert, and to just install your incredibly orderly way of life on this new population.
Exactly. So you step off the boat in the Visayas region of the Philippines, and almost immediately you just freeze. Like you are absolutely horrified.
Because what you're looking at makes zero sense to your European brain.
Yeah, totally zero sense. You are watching women essentially run the entire local economy. You see them making their own choices about marriage, about their bodies, moving around with this total autonomy.
Which is wild to think about from their perspective.
Right. And when public processions happen, the women aren't trailing meekly behind the men. They're actually walking right at the front, shaded by these beautiful silk parasols, projecting absolute authority.
It's just incredible.
You're staring at a society where the neat little boxes you brought with you from Europe just do not apply at all. And as a colonizer, you completely panic.
It's a profound culture shock. But, I think more than that, it's an existential threat to the colonizer's entire worldview.
Oh, absolutely.
Because if a society can function and thrive with women holding inherent unmanaged power, then the rigid hierarchies of Europe aren't natural laws at all, right? They are just constructed cages.
Cages, yes.
And from that exact moment of panic in 1582, this centuries-long campaign basically began. A campaign to dismantle that power, rewrite that history, and just force those women into those cages.
And that campaign, that intense friction between the people building the cages and the people refusing to be put inside them is exactly what we are exploring today. So welcome to this deep dive.
Glad to be here for this one. It's a massive topic.
It really is. And I want to say right up front, if you are listening to this and you have ever been sitting in a classroom or maybe at a family dinner or just scrolling through your phone.
Oh, yeah. The phone scrolling definitely brings this up.
Totally. And you suddenly felt this suffocating realization that the world is trying to stuff you into a very specific box, telling you how to speak, how to dress, what role you have to play, then this conversation is absolutely for you.
It really hits close to home for anyone who's ever felt that way.
Yeah. Today is for anyone who has ever felt that tiny rebellious spark that just says, I cannot breathe in here.
Well said. So today we are diving into a truly phenomenal academic paper. It's by Artchil, Daug, and it's titled The Woman Does Not Exist, Feminine Sexuality and Philippine History.
Which I know is a very heavy title.
It is. It sounds incredibly heavy. It sounds like this dense, impenetrable university theory. But the actual mission of this text, and honestly our mission today, is to take these massive concepts about identity, power, and society and just bring them right down to earth.
Because at its core, this isn't just a dusty history paper, right? It is a story about rebels.
Yeah.
It's about historical mystics, fictional movie characters, and everyday people who simply refuse to fit the script society handed to them. It is about the absolute courage it takes to find your true voice when the entire world is screaming at you to be quiet, to be normal, to just fit in.
And to guide us through this massive historical and psychological landscape, the author uses this really brilliant structure.
I loved the structure of this paper.
It's so good. We are going to walk through 3 distinct acts, and each act is anchored by a very specific, deeply visual scene from a film.
Oh, the movie metaphors are the best part.
They really are. We will look at a character named Ellen, a character named Dieyi, and a character named Anora. And then finally, we will arrive at a really powerful historical epilogue.
It's quite the journey.
It is. Through these cinematic metaphors, the paper traces the hidden history of feminine power in the Philippines, examines the brutal mechanisms used to suppress it, and, witnesses how it constantly and stubbornly breaks back out.
Okay, let's unpack this. I want you to close your eyes for a second. Imagine you are sitting in a massive old movie theater. The velvet curtains pull back, the lights go completely down until the room is pitch black.
I can see it.
A projector hums to life, the screen flickers, and we step directly into the dark, shadowy world of Act 1.
Act 1 is fundamentally about the metaphor of containment. We're looking at what happens when a radical, beautiful energy is managed and just swallowed by a system.
Right. And the author anchors this act with a scene from the classic silent horror film Nosferatu.
Oh, such a creepy movie.
Super creepy. We are introduced to this character named Ellen, and the lighting in this scene is so crucial to the metaphor. It is near total darkness.
Yeah, very German expressionist.
Exactly. As the dim light slowly reveals Ellen, we see that her face is literally split down the middle by a harsh shadow. Like half of her is in the light and half of her is entirely swallowed by the dark.
It is such a visceral, chilling image right from the start.
And she is completely desperate in this scene. She is trembling, her hands are clasped tight, and she is just whispering out into the empty void of her room.
What does she say?
She says, come to me, a guardian angel, a spirit of comfort, a spirit of any celestial sphere, anything, hear my call, come to me.
Wow.
It is this incredibly raw, unfiltered plea. You can actually feel the ache in her voice, even in a silent movie, you know. She is trapped in this mundane reality, and she is searching for something so much bigger than herself, something transcendent.
The author describes Ellen's plea here as an act of radical openness.
Which is a great phrase.
Radical openness. I love that.
Think about what it actually takes to throw your doors wide open to the universe like that, without any conditions. She's making herself completely vulnerable to the unknown.
But here's the tragedy of the scene, right? What answers her call is absolutely not an angel. It is not a spirit of comfort.
Not even close. She walks over to her balcony door. The sheer curtains are fluttering in a cold wind. And suddenly, this massive, unnatural shadow looms up against the wall. It is Count Orlok.
The vampire himself.
Yes. And he doesn't just walk in and say hello. He immediately issues this terrifying decree. He towers over her, telling her that her call has awakened him from an eternity of darkness.
Oh, that's so intense.
And then he says, you are not for the living. You are not for humankind.
He doesn't offer her comfort at all. He demands absolute possession of her.
Exactly. He tells her she must swear herself to him for all eternity. And the saddest part, she actually does it. She looks at this terrifying force and whispers, I swear.
And this is where the visual storytelling becomes deeply unsettling, according to the paper. As soon as she makes that oath, she lets out this strange, ambiguous moaning sound.
The text points out that it is caught somewhere right on the border between ecstasy and agony, right?
Yes. Her body starts to convulse violently. Now, to Ellen, it feels like this dark, overwhelming force is choking her, just consuming her.
But the camera gives us a different perspective.
Exactly. From the outside, looking at her writhing on the floor, it actually appears as though she is strangling herself.
Oh, wow.
Her limbs twist, her breath stops, and the screen abruptly cuts to black. The pact is sealed.
It is absolute horror. She asked the universe for an expansive, elevating connection, and instead she was met by this massive institutional force that completely consumed her.
Radical openness answered with total containment.
Yes, and the author uses this dark, terrifying movie scene to introduce us to a very real, incredibly brave group of historical women in the 17th century Philippines. They were known as the Beatas.
And to understand the Beatas and why Ellen's story perfectly mirrors theirs, we really have to look at the incredibly strict world they lived in.
Right, the Spanish colonial era.
The author introduces us to a woman named Hermana Sebastiana de Santa Maria. She was born in 1652 in the town of Pasig.
And her background is so important here.
It is. Sebastiana was an India, meaning an indigenous woman. She was poor, she was completely unlettered, she had absolutely no access to wealth, no formal education, and she certainly had no connections to the elite inner circles of the Spanish colonial Catholic Church.
And yet, against all conceivable odds, she became a spiritual prodigy.
She really did.
This is the part of the text that absolutely fascinated me. She became recognized as the very first known beata in the Philippines. But she didn't achieve this by enrolling in a formal seminary or passing a theological exam.
Or getting a stamped certificate of approval from a wealthy Spanish bishop.
Exactly. She didn't use their system at all. She relied entirely on raw, pure instinct.
Her spiritual journey was the ultimate DIY endeavor.
Yeah.
Just do it yourself.
Yeah, spiritual DIY.
From a very early age, she began engaging in highly extreme physical and spiritual practices. We are talking about severe fasting, going days without sustenance.
Which is incredibly intense.
Very. She wore hair shirts, and if you don't know, these are incredibly coarse, abrasive garments designed to cause deliberate physical discomfort and pain.
Yeah, not comfortable at all.
Not at all. And she sought out absolute, terrifying solitude. She was plunging herself into these profound, overwhelming states of mystical reflection completely on her own, without a guide, without a priest, without a safety net.
I really want to frame this for anyone listening who might be a young person today. Think about it. Imagine you have this burning, all-consuming passion for something.
Like art or music.
Yeah, maybe it is art, or digital activism, or music. But the only way you are supposedly allowed to do it is if you join the official school club. where a teacher hands you a syllabus, tells you the correct way to paint or play, and grades your performance.
Right, the official system.
But instead of doing that, you just bypass the entire school system. You lock yourself in your room, you teach yourself by trial and fire, you break all the traditional rules of the medium, and you start producing masterpieces. You completely ignore the official rule book.
That is exactly what Sebastiana was doing, but with intense spiritual mysticism. And we really have to remember the context of the time. This is the Spanish colonial Catholic Church. It is highly structured, incredibly wealthy, strictly patriarchal, and deeply, deeply obsessed with its own rules.
They loved their rules.
They did. In that environment, a DIY approach to God wasn't just highly unusual, it was deeply rebellious. It was actually dangerous.
It was a threat.
The author notes that Nick Joaquin, the famous Filipino writer whose historical essays deeply informed this section of the paper, he believed that Sebastiana's spiritual formation was directed not by the institution of the church, but by the Holy Spirit itself.
It was just completely raw.
It was raw. It was mystical. And crucially, it was completely unregulated. It happened entirely outside the domain and the control of the Spanish friars.
And what makes it a movement, right, is that she wasn't the only one.
No, not at all.
This wild, unregulated, independent spirituality started catching on like absolute wildfire among certain women.
It really resonated.
The text mentions Beata Maria Guinita of Pangasinan, who passed away in 1673. She didn't just pray quietly in a pew. She was famous for having intense, uncontrollable visions and hearing what her contemporaries described as suave, heavenly music.
Oh, wow.
She was experiencing the divine in a completely sensory, unmediated way.
Then you have Francisca Fuentes. She was a young widow who suddenly began experiencing vivid visions of St. Francis and St. Dominic.
And what did she do? She didn't go report to a priest to ask what they meant?
Right, she didn't ask for permission. She immediately mobilized. She began serving the sick and the destitute on her own authority.
And we absolutely have to talk about Antonia Esguerra.
Yes, her story is so interesting.
She was a Creole widow, meaning she came from a totally different social class than Sebastiana. Antonia was part of elite society.
She had money and status.
Exactly. But she looked at that high society life with all its rigid social expectations for a wealthy widow, and she completely withdrew from it. She adopted strict asceticism, giving up all her luxuries, and then she did something incredibly radical. She turned her own private home into a spiritual refuge.
She basically created a sanctuary.
Yes. Her house became the very first informal beaterio. It became an underground gathering place for women like Sebastiana and Francisca.
They were forming their own grassroots collectives.
Literally. They went out into the community, they visited the sick, they fed the poor, they distributed alms, and the most important detail here is that they did all of this completely independently.
That's the key.
They didn't take formal vows that bound them to a male religious order. They weren't locked away behind the high walls of a cloistered convent. They were layered, highly improvisational communities of women striving for spiritual rigor entirely on their own terms.
Which, of course, brings us to the inevitable historical collision. You have this growing movement of women operating totally outside the system. They're gaining followers, they're gaining immense respect from the local communities because, let's be honest, they are the ones actually doing the hard work of feeding the poor.
Right.
And they're doing it all without a Spanish priest mediating their connection to the divine.
Okay, wait, I have to jump in here. I am stuck on this, and I feel like anyone listening might be wondering the exact same thing.
What's that?
On paper, aren't these women doing exactly what the religion teaches? Like, they are praying, they are fasting, they are feeding the hungry, they are being incredibly devout.
True.
Why on earth would the official church be so threatened by a group of women who just wanted to help the poor? Why would a bishop care if a teenager is fasting in her room? They aren't leading an armed rebellion, you know?
It is the perfect question, and the answer gets to the very core of how power actually operates.
Okay, explain.
The threat wasn't in what they were doing. The threat was in how they were doing it. The colonial church was a massive hierarchical bureaucratic institution. Its entire monopoly on power rested on one fundamental idea.
Which was?
The idea that you, a regular person, cannot reach God on your own. You need our priests, you need our approved rituals, you need our Latin masses, and most importantly, you need our permission.
Ah, Right.
When these unlettered indigenous women started having direct mystical experiences, hearing heavenly music, and speaking of God without any priestly mediation, they made the entire institutional hierarchy look completely unnecessary.
Oh, so it wasn't a threat to the theology, it was a threat to the monopoly.
Exactly.
Like, if I can get the product directly from the source, why do I need the middleman?
That's exactly it. And the author points out something even deeper here, something deeply historical. These women, whether they consciously realized it or not, were resurrecting a dangerous memory.
A memory of what?
They were echoing a pre-colonial past. Before the Spanish ships ever arrived, indigenous women in the Philippines held immense religious, sexual, and social authority. The spiritual leaders were women.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that connection.
Yeah, so by acting so independently now, the Beatas were blurring the lines between Christian mysticism and indigenous spiritual autonomy. They were carving out female-led spaces entirely outside of male ecclesiastical control. And that was a terrifying prospect for the colonizers.
Because authorities, especially colonial authorities, absolutely despise anything they cannot measure, track, and control.
They hate it.
They looked at these autonomous women, looked at their growing influence, and decided they were far too radical to be left alone. So the church did exactly what Count Orlok did to Ellen in that opening movie scene. They didn't destroy them outright, they absorbed them.
The timeline of this containment is incredibly telling, and it shows how bureaucracies choke out organic movements.
Give me the timeline.
In 1696, the church officially founded the Beaterio de Santa Catalina. Now, the text is very specific here. We shouldn't think of this as just giving the women a nice building. This was not a traditional convent, and it was no longer a free lay home.
So what was it?
It was an institution specifically designed by the church to oversee, discipline, and contain this spontaneous religious expression. They took this radical, sprawling, unpredictable grassroots movement and forced it into a manageable, church-approved box. They gave them a rule book.
Oh, it is such a frustratingly familiar story.
It really is.
Think about a time you and your friends started something amazing. Maybe a mutual aid project, a zine, a neighborhood garden, or an underground club. You did it purely out of passion, and it works. It gets popular.
Yeah, you built something real.
And then suddenly the school administration or the local city council steps in and says, we love what you are doing. It's so inspiring. But for insurance reasons, you need a faculty advisor. You need to meet in this specific room at this specific time. You have to fill out these forms, and you need to run all your ideas by the principal first.
And just like that, the magic is gone.
Exactly. Suddenly, the raw magic is totally gone. The radical possibility has been managed. The system swallowed it.
That is the perfect analogy. The system wraps its arms around the rebellion and squeezes the life out of it under the guise of supporting it.
It's so insidious.
And the tragedy of the Beatas is that they realized what was happening, and they fought this containment bitterly. In 1704, the tension reached a breaking point. The Beaterio de Santa Catalina was dissolved by the authorities, and their independent community was basically declared unlawful. They were ordered to disband.
But they were so stubborn, they didn't just give up and go home, right?
Yeah. No, they fought back. By 1706, they actually managed to return and reestablish themselves, albeit under strict new rules and restrictions.
They just wouldn't quit.
Decades later, the spirit was still there. In 1735, other sisters founded an entirely new Beaterio, trying to continue the fight for some semblance of autonomy.
But the authorities were still cracking down.
Oh, yeah. They were so paranoid about these women that even as late as 1755, King Ferdinand IV of Spain, sitting thousands of miles away in Europe, was literally issuing royal decrees trying to legally limit their reach and restrict their numbers.
A literal king, worried about a group of women praying and feeding the poor in the Philippines. It shows you the sheer scale of the anxiety they provoked.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
But ultimately, the system is relentless. It has endless resources, endless time, and endless rules.
Which is exactly why the author pairs the history of the Beatas with Ellen's story from Nosferatu. Ellen asked for a celestial spirit to elevate her, but she got Orlok, who demanded her total submission. The Beatas sought a pure, unfiltered connection with the divine, but they were swallowed by a patriarchal institution that took their genuine spiritual suffering, repackaged it, and turned it into something the church could regulate and take credit for.
Ellen stepping across that threshold into the dark, convulsing on the floor, making those ambiguous moans of ecstasy and agony. That is the visual metaphor for that historical loss.
She entered containment. Her radical openness became the very thing that trapped her.
If we pull back and look at the bigger picture, Act 1 shows us the first and perhaps most common method society uses to handle people who don't fit into the box. Assimilation, absorption.
Just keep them up.
The system takes a rebellious energy, slaps its own logo on it, and rebrands it so that it serves the institution instead of threatening it.
But as we transition into Act 2, the author asks a much more explosive question.
Yeah, things get intense here.
What happens when a person simply cannot be absorbed? What happens when the box doesn't just contain the person, but the person fundamentally shatters the box?
This is where the tension really ramps up.
Let's head into Act 2. The lights in our imaginary theater dim once again. This act is called The Stage, and it centers on a very different metaphor, the metaphor of rupture.
I love this act.
Our cinematic anchor for this section is an incredibly complex character named Dieyi from the masterpiece film Farewell, My Concubine.
The scene the author paints for us here is intensely uncomfortable. It is dripping with high stakes and anxiety.
Set the scene for us.
We are looking at a traditional Chinese opera troupe. They're putting on a private performance, and they are desperately trying to impress a wealthy, powerful patron.
So a lot is on the line.
The entire financial survival of the troupe depends on this man's approval. Dieyi steps forward to deliver a crucial line.
Now, we need to establish Dieyi's background because it is the key to everything in this act.
It's vital context.
Dieyi was assigned male at birth. But from a very young age, she has been trained under grueling, physically abusive conditions to play the Dan, the female role of the concubine, on stage.
Right.
Her entire existence has been molded to perform absolute idealized femininity for an audience.
Exactly. And in this specific performance they are putting on for the patron, her character is dressed as a nun. Dieyi steps up to the mark to deliver her line. But under the immense pressure, she messes it up.
What'd she say?
Instead of reciting the script, which calls for her to say she is a girl, she accidentally reverts to the reality of her physical body. She says, "I am by nature a boy."
Oh, no.
It is a jarring, massive contradiction to the female character she is supposed to be flawlessly embodying. The illusion is broken. The wealthy patron is immediately unimpressed, loses interest, and actually starts to get up to leave.
The financial ruin of the troupe is seconds away, and the reaction from her stage partner, Xiaolu, is instantaneous, visceral, and terrifyingly violent.
It's a really hard scene to watch.
In sheer panic over losing the patron's money, and furious at Dieyi for breaking the illusion, Xiaolu lashes out. He grabs Dieyi, forces her down into a chair, and violently shoves a long, heavy smoking pipe deep into her mouth.
He shoves it in so roughly, so brutally, that he actually cuts her lips and draws blood.
It is a horrific moment of abuse. He is physically, violently forcing the script back into her mouth. He is punishing her for deviating from the role she was assigned to play.
And then, trembling, bleeding from the mouth, with the rest of the troupe frantically trying to keep the music going, Dieyi delivers the correct line.
She looks out and says, "I am by nature a girl."
But the author points out something incredible here. As Dieyi says that line, "I am by nature a girl," there's a massive tectonic shift in her tone.
Something inside her doesn't just submit.
Right. Something breaks open. Or, more accurately, something deeply buried is finally revealed. She isn't just reciting a line anymore to save the troupe. She is stating a profound personal truth.
To understand why this bloody, violent moment on a stage is so monumental philosophically, the author introduces us to some advanced psychological theory. Specifically, the ideas of the famous French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan.
Okay, here is where it gets really interesting.
And I want to make a promise to you listening right now. We are about to talk about high-level 20th century psychoanalytic theory, the kind of stuff people write PhDs on.
It can get very dense.
But we are not going to make it sound like a dusty, confusing textbook. We are going to translate this so it makes perfect intuitive sense for your actual life.
Let's do it. The author brings up one of Lacan's most infamous, provocative, and frankly, frequently misunderstood phrases.
Which is,
"The woman does not exist." Furthermore, Lacan claimed, there is no such thing as a sexual relationship.
Now, we have to pause immediately because obviously this does not mean that women, as living, breathing, biological human beings, aren't real.
Of course not. It is a statement about societal structures and the illusions we build to maintain order.
Right. Let's break this down. Society operates on the desperate hope that everything can be perfectly categorized.
Yeah, we love categories.
Imagine society is a giant, rigid, perfectly designed smartphone operating system like iOS. The operating system demands that every single piece of data has a specific file format. It demands that there are perfect complementary pairs, men and women, masculine and feminine.
The neat little boxes again.
Exactly. The system tells us that these two categories fit together perfectly, harmoniously, without any friction, and that everyone has a natural, exact folder they're supposed to drop themselves into.
But Lacan is stepping in and saying, look closer, that perfect harmony, that universal ideal of the woman as the flawless puzzle piece that perfectly completes the man puzzle piece. It is an absolute illusion.
It doesn't actually exist.
No, it doesn't exist in the deep structure of human reality. Society just pretends it does, because the alternative, admitting that human identity is messy, infinite, and doesn't fit into boxes, is terrifying to the people running the system.
The author explains this through two different ways of thinking, which Lacan calls the masculine logic of the exception and the feminine logic of the not all.
Let's stick with our computer analogy to make this crystal clear.
Okay.
The masculine logic is exactly like that rigid smartphone OS. It is entirely about rules, boundaries, and limits. It operates by drawing a hard line and saying, everything inside this box is normal. If you step outside the box, you are the exception, and you will be deleted or disciplined.
It is contained, it is rigid, it needs walls to exist.
Conversely, the feminine logic, which Lacan calls the not all, is completely different. It is like an infinite string of open source code.
Oh, I like that.
It refuses to be completely contained by any boundaries.
Yeah.
In the feminine logic, nothing is held back, nothing escapes, and therefore, no single universal rule can ever define it once and for all. It exists outside the neat, tidy boxes of the operating system. It spills over the edges.
And here is the crucial, tragic part of Lacan's theory. He argues that these two logics do not naturally harmonize.
They just don't fit.
There is no perfect puzzle piece fit between the rigid box and the infinite spill. There is always a gap. There is always a friction. There is always a fundamental impossibility.
And Dieyi's entire life is lived inside that terrifying gap.
It really is.
The author gives us the devastating details of her childhood. She was born with an extra finger, and before she could even enter the opera school, that extra finger was literally chopped off by her mother.
Think about the symbolism of that violence. That cut wasn't just physical surgery. It was society carving a label into a child's flesh.
Exactly.
It was a demand from the system. You have a male body, but you have an anomaly. We are going to cut off the anomaly and force you to fit into the boy box.
But then, almost immediately, she is thrown into the brutal training of the opera. Here she is beaten, starved, and meticulously molded to perfectly embody the ultimate, exaggerated feminine role, the concubine.
She is forced to inhabit femininity so totally, so flawlessly, that she becomes indistinguishable from her character.
So look at her reality. The world outside the theater forces her into a strict binary that cannot hold her, demanding she be a boy. But inside the theater, the rules demand she be the perfect woman.
It brings up this incredible concept of the masquerade. We talk a lot today about wearing masks.
So all the time.
If you are a young person listening, you know exactly what this is. You have your main Instagram account where you perform the perfect student or perfect friend for your family and acquaintances. Then you have your Finsta, your private account, where you are messy and real.
Right. The curated self versus the real self.
We usually think of the public mask as the lie and taking the mask off as showing our true self. We think performance is fake, but for Dieyi, it is the exact opposite.
Yes, this is a brilliant inversion. The masquerade of the opera, the heavy makeup, the costumes, the scripts. It isn't a deception for Dieyi. It is the only place she is actually allowed to be real.
Because outside the stage, the real world is constantly interrogating her.
Making her justify her existence in a body and a societal role that doesn't fit her. But inside the opera, under the veil of pure performance, the world finally stops asking questions. She isn't failing to be a man, and she isn't pretending to be a woman. On the stage, cloaked in the masquerade, she is simply allowed to exist.
The performance provides the cover for her profound truth.
Which makes the specific monologue she is reciting in that bloody scene so incredibly powerful.
Let's look closely at the lines she says. At 16, I am a nun, yet I am by nature a girl, not a boy. Why must I wear these sexless robes? Despite myself, desire burns in my heart.
The author dissects this beautifully. In the literal plot of the opera they are putting on, the character is a young nun who is being taken from her convent and given to a king to be his concubine.
So on the surface, it is a story of a woman moving from pure, detached religious chastity into a life of sexual servitude and political submission.
But Dieyi isn't just reciting a 500-year-old script. The author argues that she is using the script to confess her own agonizing reality.
Think about the phrase, these sexless robes.
Yeah, that's key.
The author says these nuns' robes are a metaphor for the boring, neutral, suffocating expectations society forced on her when they chopped off her finger and told her she had to be a boy. Society threw a heavy gray robe over her true, complex identity and said, hide under this, be neutral, don't cause trouble.
So when Xiaolu jams that pipe into her mouth, and she finally bleeds, and her tone shifts, and she looks out and says, I am by nature a girl, not a boy. She isn't just correcting a flubbed line.
She is breaking the rules from inside the performance.
This is what the author calls a rupture.
Let's compare her to Act 1 for a second. Ellen was swallowed by the dark system. She was absorbed and contained.
Right, assimilation.
But Dieyi stands right in the middle of the system, uses its own script, bleeds its own blood, and cracks the entire structure wide open. She states a truth of her own existence that the rigid societal structure simply cannot process without crashing.
It is the ultimate act of defiance, but it comes at a deeply painful cost. She finishes the line, despite myself, desire burns in my heart.
She is admitting that all the physical beatings, all the brutal discipline, all the societal pressure to conform didn't extinguish who she really was.
It only compressed it, making the desire to be her true self burn incredibly hot. The real feminine subject, her true uncontainable self, emerges right through the crack in the stage performance.
And this brings us to a really profound, chilling warning from a contemporary philosopher named Alenka Zupančič, whom the author heavily quotes here.
Zupančič analyzes how highly oppressive societies function. She says that the most oppressive societies are the ones that are utterly obsessed with defining exactly what everyone's role is. They desperately need to prove that their operating system is perfect.
Right, because if everyone just quietly accepts their exact definition, I'm a student, I am obedient, I am a boy, I am a girl, I am a worker.
Then nobody asks any fundamental questions.
Exactly. The machinery hums along, and the people in power get to stay in power without ever being challenged.
And Zupančič writes this devastating line. She says, if there is to be a relation, women need to be such and such. A woman who doesn't know her place is a menace to the image of the relation.
I want you, listening right now, to let that word sink in. A menace.
It's a strong word.
When society hands you a script, when it tells you exactly how you need to dress, how you should speak, what career is appropriate for your background, who you are allowed to love, and you question that role, you don't just become an annoyance, you become a menace to them.
Because your very existence, your refusal to fit into their puzzle, proves that their perfect, orderly world is entirely fake. You threaten the illusion that keeps them in power.
Dieyi was a menace because she embodied that not all. She was a remainder that the system couldn't mathematically categorize. She had a male body, so society called her a man, but she inhabited a feminine truth that completely ruptured their logic.
She couldn't be absorbed like the Beatas. She couldn't be neatly filed away. She remained a permanent, unresolved tension.
Which is incredibly brave, but also, as the text makes painfully clear, incredibly dangerous. The system absolutely loathes unresolved tension. When it can't absorb you, it tries to crush you.
So what does this all mean for the broader scope of human history?
Right. How do we take this deeply intimate psychological idea of the rupture and the menace on a theater stage and apply it to the history of an entire nation?
That massive pivot brings us to Act 3.
The transition the author makes here is incredibly sharp. We move away from the grandeur, the costumes, and the high drama of a traditional Chinese opera stage, and we drop into a setting that is intensely cramped, deeply ordinary, and aggressively modern.
Act 3 is called The Car, and it explores our final metaphor, the echo.
And the cinematic anchor for this section is a character named Anora from a recent film.
I want to paint this picture carefully because the tone is entirely different from the last two. It is an intensely intimate, highly claustrophobic scene.
Set it up for us.
Anora is sitting in the front seat of a parked car with a man named Igor. Now, Anora is initiating physical intimacy, but she isn't doing it from a place of vulnerability.
It's a transaction.
Exactly. She is doing it with this highly practiced, tough, almost mechanical confidence. It is a transactional performance. She feels completely in control because she knows exactly what role she is playing. She has the script memorized.
She is wearing a profound psychological armor.
But then a sudden, quiet break happens. Igor stops following the script.
What does he do?
He doesn't look at her with lust. He doesn't look at her as a transaction or as an object to be consumed. He looks up at her with genuine, unshielded, utter tenderness. He holds her gaze, and for the first time, he actually sees her. Not as a role, not as a transaction, but as a whole, complex, breathing human being.
And the author writes a sentence here that hit me like a ton of bricks. He writes, "That gaze is unbearable."
Unbearable.
Anora tries to keep her tough performance going. She tries to keep the armor up, but she can't. The simple fact that he is looking at her with real, undeniable humanity completely shatters her defenses.
And what happens?
Out of sheer panic, out of a sudden, terrifying vulnerability, she violently slaps him hard across the face. And then, almost immediately, she completely collapses. She breaks down into these full-bodied, uncontrollable, ugly sobs.
And Igor's reaction is vital to this scene. He doesn't get angry that she hit him. He doesn't demand anything. He simply holds her as she weeps.
It's just so raw.
There is no sweeping cinematic music in this scene. There is no neat Hollywood closure where everything is explained. It is just the raw sound of a woman weeping in a parked car because the experience of being truly seen completely broke her.
So we have to ask the obvious question. Why does being truly seen hurt so much? Why would a look of gentle tenderness cause a total emotional breakdown?
It is because Anora has spent her entire life building an impenetrable shell to survive.
She lives in a modern world that only values her when she fits into a highly specific, objectified, transactional box. To survive the brutality of that world, she had to become the box. She had to harden herself.
When Igor looks at her with love, he completely bypasses the box. And without that armor, she has absolutely no idea how to exist in that space without falling apart.
This raises a massive structural question for the paper. How does Anora's modern breakdown in a cramped car connect to the sweeping history of the Philippines?
The author makes a brilliant, devastating pivot right here. Anora's tears, the author argues, are not just her own isolated fictional griefs. They are the historical echo of an entire history of women who were violently erased.
So what does this all mean? We are going back to the Spanish colonial period, and the author does something incredibly clever here. He pulls from actual historical accounts written by Spanish friars and colonial administrators in the 16th and 17th centuries.
And what is wild about these documents is that these men were writing these reports back to Spain to complain about the indigenous women or to try and figure out how to correct their wild behavior.
But by writing it all down, they accidentally preserved the indisputable proof of how incredibly powerful these women used to be.
Let's look closely at the accounts from 1604 and 1605, recorded by Father Pedro Chirino and Father Gabriel Sanchez.
Okay, what do they say?
They detail multiple stories of indigenous women who were fiercely, violently resisting the unwanted sexual advances of armed Spanish soldiers. These women were refusing large sums of money. They were fighting off physical violence.
And there's that one incredible case.
Yes, a woman fled her village, ran into the rugged, dangerous mountains, and survived out there alone for 4 months just to maintain her physical autonomy and escape a soldier.
Okay, I have to stop here because the logic of the colonizers is just mind-boggling. How did the Spanish friars interpret this incredible bravery?
You're not going to believe it.
Father Sanchez writes this down in his official report and basically says, look at these amazing examples of Christian virtue. They are such good, chaste Christians. They are defending their purity just like good European Catholic girls.
It's hilarious and tragic at the same time.
Wait, what? Why would they call it Christian virtue? Weren't these women actively fighting the Christian colonizers?
It is a stunning display of cognitive dissonance. The author completely dismantles Father Sanchez's interpretation. Remember, these events happened only a few decades after the Spanish arrived.
So they hadn't been Christians very long.
Right. The author asks the vital question. Can we really believe that these fierce acts of life or death resistance can be attributed to these women suddenly internalizing European Christian morality manuals in a matter of years?
No, absolutely not. The text argues this wasn't Christian virtue at all. This was an ancient indigenous logic of fierce, undeniable independence.
Exactly.
These women weren't refusing the soldiers because they read a pamphlet on colonial modesty. They were refusing them because they were powerful, autonomous, pre-colonial women who fundamentally believed they belonged to themselves and to no man.
The friars' brains simply could not process a woman having power outside of their religious framework. So to keep their own worldview from collapsing, they slapped the label of Christian virtue on it to make it make sense to them.
And the evidence of this profound pre-colonial autonomy gets even stronger when we look at the Visayas region a little earlier, in 1582.
Right. The accounts from explorers like Miguel de la Orca and the famous conqueror Legazpi.
They are filled with absolute horror and moral panic.
They write extensively about women in Cebu who are active, dominant economic agents, women who have total sexual autonomy, women who move freely through society without any regard whatsoever for the modesty customs of Spain.
Legazpi was practically pulling his hair out in his letters. He complained endlessly that the women were conducting themselves with total freedom, and no matter what laws he passed, he couldn't stamp it out.
Lorca called them beautiful, but unchaste. He was deeply disgusted that their society didn't punish adultery the way Europe did, and that the women controlled their own marriages, their own wealth, and their own family planning. It completely broke his brain.
Because what the Spanish observers were witnessing wasn't a failure of morality, it was an entirely different moral and economic universe.
It was a world structured completely outside the patriarchal evangelical system they were aggressively trying to impose. These women lived in a system where their absolute autonomy wasn't a scandal, it was the baseline norm.
And it wasn't just happening in the Visayas. Look at the island of Luzon in 1609. The colonial administrator, Antonio de Morga, wrote a fascinating account observing how indigenous people conducted themselves in public spaces.
This is the procession detail.
Yes. He noted that in formal public processions, the women walked ahead of their husbands, their brothers, and their fathers. They walked at the very front of the line, shielded from the sun by beautiful silk parasols held by their attendants.
I want to spend a moment letting you, the listener, really visualize that scene. Picture the deeply ingrained societal rules of the Spanish colonizers who were watching this. Rules centered entirely around female silence, female modesty, and the absolute requirement to walk behind the man as a physical sign of submission.
And then flip that power dynamic entirely.
In pre-colonial Luzon, women were structurally privileged in the public space. Their visibility wasn't a sign of temptation or danger or vanity. It was a sign of immense cultural stature and unquestioned authority.
It is breathtaking to imagine, just pure, unbothered swagger.
Truly.
But it also makes the tragedy of colonization so much sharper, because the colonizers couldn't just let that stand. A woman who walks at the front of the procession, who controls her own money, who owns her own body. Remember Zupatush's warning from Act 2?
That woman is a menace to their system.
Yes, she fundamentally threatens the architecture of their control. She has to be dealt with.
And this leads to the brutal demonization of the remainder. The women who couldn't be absorbed into institutions like the Beatas, and who couldn't be ignored, had to be turned into literal monsters.
The text mentions the aniteras and the Catalonans, right?
Yes, the native indigenous priestesses who held the spiritual power before the friars arrived.
Like Katinga.
Exactly. Kakinga was a powerful spiritual leader. But Diego Duarte, a Spanish chronicler, didn't write about her as a respected counterpart. He explicitly cast her as a sorceress.
He wrote that she was a witch who stirred up the indigenous people, destroyed wealth, and actively incited open, violent rebellion against Christian teachings.
And what were the people shouting when they followed Kakenga into the mountains to rebel? They were crying, "Liberty!"
They weren't just fighting for patches of land. They were fighting for the freedom to exist in their own cultural reality, where women held power.
But the colonizers couldn't debate them on theological grounds, so they labeled them demons. That is the ultimate recurring tragedy of history. When powerful, autonomous women cannot be managed, controlled, or absorbed, they are literally called agents of the devil.
By the time we get to the 19th century, around 1842 in the writings of Sinibaldo de Mas, the native priestesses have been largely violently suppressed, and the Beatas have been heavily institutionalized.
But the underlying colonial anxiety remains completely intact.
Mas writes at length about the simple seductiveness of Filipina girls and how their very existence continually threatens the virtue and the focus of the Spanish friars.
It is almost comical in its hypocrisy. The friars have all the political power, they've built the massive stone institutions, they've written all the laws, they hold the guns, but they are still terrified of the women just existing.
The wild, uncontainable truth of feminine existence, what Lacan called the not all, never actually went away. It couldn't be permanently deleted. It just kept bubbling up through the floorboards, making the authorities sweat, constantly slipping through the tiny cracks of their rigid, paranoid system.
Which brings the author's massive argument full circle, pulling us right back to the modern day, back to Anora weeping uncontrollably in that cramped parked car.
Right. Anora isn't just one modern fictional girl having a bad night in a movie. In the author's brilliant synthesis, she is the profound historical echo of all those powerful women from Luzon and the Visayas.
When Igor looks at her with real tenderness, he accidentally chips away at the heavy, transactional, cynical armor she was forced to forge by a society that only values women as commodities.
And what spills out of that tiny crack in the armor? The real, the uncontainable truth, the grief.
It is the deep historical grief of an autonomy that was brutally erased centuries ago and replaced by a society obsessed with putting women into tiny, manageable, transactional boxes.
Her tears, the author states emphatically, are not a sign of weakness. They're the eruption of a history that refused to stay silent.
The Beatas were absorbed, the aniteras were cast out and burned as witches, the free women of the Visayas were rewritten as unchaste sinners.
But Anora's breakdown in the car is the uncontainable remainder. It is the undeniable proof that the wild, autonomous spirit was never truly defeated. It was only forced underground, waiting to echo back.
It literally gives me chills to see a modern movie scene connected so flawlessly to a 16th century colonial document.
It sets up the final, crowning piece of this deep dive perfectly, the epilogue. We've traveled from a dark, vampiric castle with Count Orlok, to a violent Chinese opera stage, to a cramped modern car, to the ancient sunlit processions of Luzon. Now we arrive at the absolute brink of a revolution.
The author chooses to close the paper with a story. It is a distilled version of a piece called Pahayag, which was written by the revolutionary hero Emilio Jacinto in 1896.
This was published in the Katipunan's underground newspaper, Kalayaan, just months before the massive Philippine Revolution against Spain violently broke out.
The story Jacinto tells goes like this. It is a dark, oppressive night. There are no stars in the sky. The only light comes from a single, flickering lamp. And there is a youth, bowed down in absolute crushing grief, crying in the dark.
He is right on the very edge of complete, paralyzing despair. Suddenly, he feels a gentle touch on his shoulder. A soft, clear voice asks him, "Why do you cry?"
The youth slowly looks up and sees a shadowy figure, glowing faintly in the dark like mist. He is overwhelmed and he tells the figure to leave him alone. He says his sorrows are too deep, they have no cure, and the suffering of his people is permanent.
But the figure doesn't leave. She asks, "How long will ignorance rule the hearts of men? How long until you remember me?" The youth, confused, asks who she is.
And she answers, "I am liberty. I am the beginning of all that is great and just. For me, crowns have fallen, thrones shattered. I brought down the dark inquisition. I unite people for the common good. I lifted the enslaved from the mud. But your people have forgotten me. They worship false gods. They bow to tyrants. That's why I've been gone."
The youth is stunned. He begs her to stay. He points out the window to the horrific suffering of his country. His people are starved, they're shamed, they're unjustly imprisoned, their dignity is crushed on a daily basis by the colonizers.
He thinks this suffering will earn her pity. But liberty delivers an incredibly hard, bracing truth. She says, "You weep while the enemy lives. Tears are for the dead. What is needed now is action."
And this is the line that hits the absolute hardest. I want everyone listening to hear this. Liberty says, "Your people suffer not because they're inherently weak, but because they've accepted weakness as tradition. Not all customs are good."
She tells him that if he wants her to return, he can't just sit there and cry. He must act. He must be willing to fight to break the boxes.
The lamp eventually dies, but when the morning sun comes up, the youth wakes up with a quiet, dangerous fire burning in his eyes.
It is a brilliant, transcendent way to synthesize everything we have discussed today. Now, Emilio Jacinto wrote this specifically to inspire a literal, armed revolution against the Spanish government.
But in the context of this paper, liberty isn't just a political or military concept. Liberty is the spirit of Ellen opening herself to the universe.
Liberty is the Beatas fasting in the dark to bypass the priests.
Liberty is Dieyi standing on stage, bleeding from the mouth and declaring her truth.
Liberty is the indigenous women of Luzon walking proudly at the front of the procession.
Liberty is the fundamental refusal to fit into the box. And I want to speak directly to you listening right now. When you are sitting in class or at your job or navigating the expectations of your family and you feel that deep, uncomfortable friction.
We all feel it sometimes.
When you realize you simply do not fit into the exact roles, the exact genders, the exact career paths your culture expects of you, you are not broken. You are not doing life wrong.
That friction you feel is profoundly historical. You are experiencing the exact same rebellious spark that the Catalonians had when they fled to the mountains to escape the friars.
You are feeling the exact same rupture that Dieyi felt when she spoke her uncontainable truth from inside the masquerade.
You possess the very same unmanageable reality that made the colonial authorities so incredibly anxious centuries ago.
The history of the world is, in many ways, just one long, exhausting record of powerful institutions desperately trying to shove wild, beautiful, infinite human truths into neat, easily controllable boxes.
They use rules. They use shame. They chop off fingers. They use high-minded words like virtue and tradition to build the heavy walls of those boxes.
But this deep dive, this incredible paper, proves that the truth always inevitably leaks out. The remainder always survives the system.
From Count Orlok's terrifying shadow to a bleeding Chinese opera stage, from a modern parked car to the ancient parasol-shaded processions of the Philippines, the message is remarkably clear.
The structures that oppress us, the boxes that constrain us, rely entirely on our quiet participation.
They rely on us believing that the puzzle pieces of society are natural, biological, and permanent. But they aren't. They were built by people, which means they can be questioned, they can be challenged, and ultimately they can be dismantled.
Exactly. And that brings us to the end of our journey today. But before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final thought to carry with you.
We covered a lot of ground today.
We talked a lot today about how history forced incredible, autonomous women to forget their own power, leaving them with only the echo of who they used to be. The system told them that their submission was just the way things are.
Weakness accepted as tradition, as the Ghost of Liberty said.
Yes. So think about your own life today, right now. Look at the boxes you've been placed in. What weakness, what limitation, what silence, or what exhausting performance have you been told to accept simply because it is a tradition or just the way things work around here?
It's a tough question to ask yourself.
If that glowing figure of liberty appeared to you in the dark right now, what is the one rule in your life she would tell you to finally break?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It has been a truly profound journey through cinematic metaphor, Lacanian psychology, and the deeply stubborn, enduring power of the human spirit.
Keep asking questions. Keep looking very closely at the scripts you are handed. And remember, sometimes the most powerful historical thing you can do is simply refuse to play the part. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll catch you next time.